There's a shiny new Dreadnought model in town, so let's do a deep dive on the Brutalis Dreadnought, talking about the release, the model, and analysing its leaked rules. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk everything about this Brutalis Dreadnought, recently showed off on Games Workshop's live show over at the Las Vegas Open. I feel like the model's been fairly well received, a nice new melee Redemptor Dreadnought, and I feel like it went down a bit better than those Desolators, where a fair few people aren't the biggest fans of the guns. In this video, let's talk about the way it's going to be released and some possible pricing, a bit more of an in-depth review of the model and people's opinions on it, and then in particular looking at that leaked datasheet that we have for it again, and this time doing a bit more analysis on its threat both at range and in melee, and how strong it might be in game for several chapters. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. So first up, as Games Workshop have told us, this new Brutalis Dreadnought is coming in that Strike Force Agastus box, a fairly long rumoured Space Marine kit, currently supposedly 1 or 2 months out. I would guess that we might be seeing it around about March time, though it might be towards the end of that month. In that box set you get the Dreadnought, 2 5-man Desolation squads with the rockets, 1 5-man unit of heavy intercessors, and that new multi-pose Primaris Lieutenant, because apparently you always have to have one of those. Based on their previous discounts, I'd guess it's going to be somewhere in the region of £120, €160 or $200. That's a very rough price estimate. It might be a little bit higher or lower than that, but I suspect it's not going to be too far out. I feel like maybe it's not the most helpful box if you just want this guy and nothing else. It will get an individual release after that, but that could easily be anywhere between 1 and 3 months after. Games Workshop do tend to treat those boxes as a bit of a pre-sale. When it comes out individually, I think there's a reasonable chance it'll cost the same as the Redemptor, currently £42.50, €55 or $70. I would be kind of surprised if they charged more for this than the Redemptor, definitely not impossible, but they are basically the same model, barring some weapon changes and slightly different armour plates. To be honest, if you did want to get your hands on one of these early though, I feel like this really is one of the models where you could very happily just convert it from a Redemptor Dreadnought. All you need to do is find a second fist, magnetise out those Storm Bolters for the multi-melters or heavy bolters, and stick some stubbers on top. I kind of wonder if any enterprising individuals might be making some 3D printed fists that would be compatible with the Redemptor. It'd be kind of cool to be able to magnetise between the two. Talking of the model itself though, the Brutalis Dreadnought is armed with a choice of Brutalis Fists or Brutalis Claws for the melee weapons, and if you choose the fist, then each fist has a pair of auto bolt rifles built into the back of them, and the Warhammer community people did basically say that the claws will be stronger in melee, but the fists will get you extra shooting. Kind of an interesting trade-off. Do you want the absolute best melee Dreadnought, or do you want it to have a few more anti-infantry shots for chewing through some hordes? Then for the front-facing hull-mounted weapons, we've got either heavy bolters or multi-melters there, and on the top it looks like you've just got the one choice of the twin Icarus Iron Hail heavy stubbers, a bit more anti-infantry firepower that's also weirdly a bit better against aircraft. Overall, from a modelling point of view, I feel like they've played it perhaps fairly safe. The silhouette is basically the exact same as the Redemptor, though there are a few subtle differences to the armour plates, say for example a little bit more armour at the knees and things, and perhaps some slightly bulkier armour about the shoulders as well, perhaps to represent the fact that it's going to be getting very close and personal with the enemy. In terms of feel, I think that it does hark back quite well to previous 40k kits. On the stream they did say that it was designed with the Blood Angels Furioso Dreadnought in mind. It's kind of easy to see the resemblance there, with either a pair of fists or talons being the main option. It maybe doesn't feel a million miles away from things like the Ironclad or the Leviathan either, also Dreadnoughts where you can equip a pair of different combat weapons. The legs are maybe a little bit more dynamic than the Redemptor ones. They're actually posed moving across the battlefield, I guess striding indomitably forward to get into combat. And it does look like there's a few different sarcophagus options. It looks like there's a variant one on view on the top right picture. In terms of the internet's initial reaction to this, it seems to have gone down fairly well. I feel like it's kind of rare for Games Workshop to go too far wrong with Dreadnoughts, and I feel like while opinions are always just a little bit split on aesthetics, they did quite well with the Redemptor Dreadnought being a fairly nice upscaling of a classic Space Marine model. I feel like melee 40k things also tend to get just a bit more cool factor as well, which probably doesn't hurt the Brutalis at all. Perhaps one reaction that I've seen a fair bit though is just a little bit of a surprise as to how much firepower it packs. Having twin multi-melters is a serious amount of guns, never mind the fact that you get some heavy stubber shots, and potentially a whole flurry of auto bolt rifle shots as well if you take the fists. At least in theory the fists build is kind of similar firepower to the Redemptor Dreadnought, which people maybe weren't expecting too much from a more melee focused Dreadnought. We'll do a bit of a comparison in just a second, though obviously it is going to depend on how much points this thing costs. Speaking of rules, in the past we have seen this leaked datasheet for the Redemptor Dreadnought coming from multiple sources. The stat lines seem very plausible to me. Though of course with leaks like this, there's always the possibility for things to have been changed or just got wrong a little bit. I certainly treat them as a potential teaser as opposed to raw fact. In any case though, the profile that we did get was an Elite's Choice Dreadnought with power level 10, which is the same as the Redemptor, and that would kind of imply that it's going to be around about the 190 to 200 points mark. The Redemptor itself, though, is 185 right now. It's not impossible that they might just release it to be the same as that. Statline wise, as you'd expect, it is very similar to the Redemptor. It's a 13 wound and toughness 7 dreadnought that hits on 3s, has a leadership of 8, and a 3+ save with no invul. The biggest differences about it, though, is that it gets a slightly better movement characteristic. It moves 10 inches rather than 8 according to this, and it also gets 5 attacks rather than 4. I guess that'd be Games Workshop's way of representing those 2 close combat weapons rather than 1. Basically a Redemptor Dreadnought with a little bit more movement and an extra attack, and like the Redemptor it's very likely to also get the core keyword for some easy up buffs from characters and things, plus Duty Eternal to give it -1 damage against enemy attacks. Then moving on to its weapons, on the top mounted gun that's the Twin Icarus Iron Hail Heavy Stubber, heavy 8 at strength 4, AP -1 and damage 1. That'd fit well with the profile on the top of the repulsor. Just a little bit of a weird gun, really quite nice at clearing chaff infantry, but for some reason it gets a +1 to hit against aircraft, which isn't going to make it efficient against them. I felt like the fly rule had a bit more purpose when it was just against the fly keyword in general. At least it would help out against jump infantry and things. Then for the whole mounted weapon we get the 2 heavy bolters or 2 multi-melters. Out of the 2, the multi-melters are far stronger. If they do happen to cost the same for whatever reason, with all the Space Marine free war gear recently, then I guess the multi-melters would be the way to go. I really wouldn't be surprised though if Games Workshop still give you a cost for the multi-melters. I suspect something like 10 points per extra melter gun. That'd seem fairly well balanced to me. If that does turn out to be the case, it'd be a bit take or leave, whether or not you want it to be a bit more of a mixed role shooting and melee thing, or you mainly want to focus on the combat. Speaking of which, we've got the option between those Brutalis Fists or Brutalis Claws. According to this leak, the Brutalis Fists are strength ×2, AP3 and damage D3 +3. Basically the same profile as the Redemptor Dreadnought, but getting the extra attack, and of course getting those auto bolt rifles built into each fist. Kind of interesting that if you took this rather than a Redemptor, it wouldn't actually be that much more of a combat machine, only an extra attack compared with that, so I guess it'd be more a case of trading out the guns for a whole flurry of anti-infantry shots. Otherwise though, the very close combat focused one are the Brutalis Claws, which apparently gets 2 melee attack modes. The strike profile of the Claws gives you strength ×2, so strength 14, AP -4, and damage D3 +3, but also re-rolling wound rolls against the target. AP -4 is going to be helpful against some things like Space Marines without invuls for example, but on quite a few things it might not matter all that much. And the re-roll wound rolls is really quite nice, but I would bear in mind that usually this thing's often going to be wounding on 2s anyway, anything toughness 7 or below. Rerolling 1s isn't nothing, but it's a lot less powerful than say rerolling other values if you're wounding on a 3 or worse. Otherwise though, if you're fighting against 1 wound infantry, it makes sense to use the sweep profile instead. That one gives you attacks at strength 7, AP -3 and damage 1, but double the attacks. And that means that compared with the fist upgrade, if you are fighting 1 wound models, you might well be killing double the amount of toughness 3 infantry, and that's quite a big deal against hordes. Overall, I'd say that this thing is certainly melee slanted, but definitely isn't just only a melee beast. It basically feels like a Redemptor that's more skewed towards close combat, but still retains a fairly solid amount of firepower, particularly if you pick up the melters. Just for a little bit of comparison, I thought it might be interesting to weigh it up versus the Redemptor, just in terms of how strong the shooting in melee is. Obviously, realistically, how strong it's going to be is going to depend on the final points cost that it gets, particularly if there's any extra cost for the melters compared with bolters. If it does wind up being around about the same cost as the Redemptor though, then I feel like the comparison doesn't come out too badly for the Brutalis with its extra focus on combat. Currently with one of the most typical Redemptor profiles, I'd generally be tempted to take the Macroplasma, D6 strength 9 shots at AP4 and damage 3 when you're overcharging. Then between Storm Bolters on the Onslaught Gatling Cannon you're getting another 12 to 16 anti-infantry shots out of them, depending on how close you are, plus the extra little rockets of the Icarus pod on top, with basically an autocannon's profile worth of damage. Compared with that, the Brutalis Dreadnought gets 4 anti-tank shots with the multi-melters. They will be closer range than the Macroplasma, but their shots are more reliable, plus they do have some very big advantages as well, not burning mortal wounds off you if you roll a 1, and also if you do get in within 12 inches, then that melter rule is going to kick in with some big damage. Beyond that, the stubber will get you 8 fairly good quality anti-infantry shots, or if you choose to take the fists over the claws, then that'll go up to a big 20 with all the auto bolt rifle fire. Overall, all things considered, I would rate the Brutalis maybe just a little bit worse than the Redemptor Dreadnought, though it is a lot closer than I expected. If you take the more ranged version of the Brutalis, then it's actually only a tiny bit behind. The Macroplasma versus the Multi-Melters is really quite close. If anything, the Multi-Melters might slightly have the edge in terms of value. The Brutalis does get more anti-infantry shots than the Redemptor, though I do feel they're probably outweighed by the Redemptor shots being just a little bit better quality, plus the fact that they've got that Icarus pod. The claw loadout's definitely a little bit behind, but of course you trade that out for more melee. Speaking of which, I was kind of interested by just how much damage you might be swapping out if you do choose to take the fists over the claws. I feel this is one of the times though where it really varies quite a lot depending on the target. Against some targets, the fists and the claws are really quite close to the extent where it might not matter too much, but against either very tough or very weak targets, then the claws win out quite a bit. Starting out, if you are fighting against hordes, then that is a big win for the claws, particularly against toughness 3 where they'll wound them on 2s anyway. Say if you were fighting Imperial Guardsmen, you'd expect 6 or 7 of them dead with the claws, versus around 3.3 for the fists. Against toughness 4 or 5 units with 1 wound, then the fists do a little bit better, but they're still solidly behind. For the mid targets, as mentioned, it is kind of close when you're wounding on a 2+. The wound rerolls matter less, and AP might often be redundant unless you're fighting something with high saves. Say for example, if you're in combat with standard Space Marines, then the fist loadout would kill around about 2.8 of them, where you'd average 3.9 with the claws. An extra Space Marine dead is certainly no bad thing whatsoever, but it isn't the biggest difference in the world. It gets even less if the AP doesn't matter. Say you're fighting a toughness 7 monster with a 5+ invul save, that'd be 11 wounds from the fist loadout, and 13 wounds with the claws. I'd argue not really that big a difference there. Against really tough stuff though, then the claws come into their own once more with the strike profile, and actually getting the rerolls to wound matters quite a bit. Say for example, if you're countercharging an Imperial Knight with toughness 8, the fist would do around about 11 wounds on average, where the claws go out to a really big 18 wounds, pretty much a threat that a super heavy just couldn't really ignore. Overall, I'd say that the melee damage gain kind of varies very wildly. It's anything between plus 20 and plus 100% depending on the target. I guess in theory they could be even against certain targets that turn off wound rerolls like Leagues of Votan. Maybe just for a slightly conservative estimate, you could say that the Talons would expect an extra around about 35% against an average target, though obviously it varies quite a bit as we've said. That's to be traded off against a big 12 shots at strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1 and 24-inch range, and that really is quite a helpful bit of shooting. This thing's likely to be advancing towards the enemy, it might well be able to get line of sight on say infantry units taking objectives that a lot of your army can't see. Against some valuable enemy light infantry, this could really shoot a lot of them dead straight away. It's definitely going to be very variable though. Some armies are going to care about that sort of shooting, like Eldar for example. Some armies really aren't, like say Custodes. I honestly do feel that from this initial impression, the Fists and the Talons seem kind of nicely balanced. I feel like the Talons seems like the obvious choice, but the Fist shooting is pretty powerful, and it's particularly nice as you can also advance and shoot it, so it doesn't compromise you when you're moving forward quickly. Finally, comparing the numbers to the Redemptor Dreadnought, even if you just have the extra attack, that's an extra 20% boost to your melee efficiency in general, though if you do take the Talons and then get the 20% plus the 35% on top of that, due to them stacking, you're probably looking at around about an extra 60%, so significantly fightier than the Redemptor there. Looks like at least on paper it does do its job of being a significantly more combat-focused Redemptor Dreadnought. In terms of in-game use, I feel like I do just have a few reservations about the thing. I feel like the multi-melters are probably the weapons that you want, but they are going to conflict with whether or not you advance this thing each turn and try and get it closer towards the enemy to get that melee profile in range. I feel like there might be at least a few turns when you have to make the difficult choice between whether you advance it and get closer to making a charge on the enemy the next turn, or you don't advance and you fire your heavy weapons, get a bunch of damage, but you might rob yourself of a charge later in the game. I guess it's a win-win if you're managing to hide the thing, or if you don't have anything in range of its guns, though I feel like there's going to be times that'll be quite painful. Compared with the Redemptor as well, I feel like it might be a little bit harder to castle with. They move a bit faster and want to be moving quickly towards the opponent, as opposed to sitting back and shooting. Might just be a little bit harder for characters to keep up, particularly if you might be making a charge with one of them and then maybe bringing it out of buff range. For generic Space Marine support options though, it does have some good stuff. Things like rerolls from captains look like they could be very powerful if you get them to work on both the ranged and the melee profile in the same turn. That seems like it could be a whole load of damage. Seems like it could be an interesting target for Tech Marines or the Master of the Forge as well. Repair some wounds and a +1 to hit at range and melee. A Librarian's Psychic Barrier power could also be interesting enough now that Armour of Contempt is gone. The 5+ Envol will be quite nice for it. And as a Dreadnought, it's going to have some access to some useful enough stratagems. Wisdom of the Ancients to give you some hit rerolls perhaps, or a stratagem for a 5+ save against mortal wounds. Finally, for a big core thing with a whole bunch of range and melee, I feel like it's going to have at least some decent options with just about every single one of the chapters, though I feel like a fair few of them might just have a little bit more synergy with it than others. White Scars I think are always going to be kind of tempting with anything with a big melee profile. Advance and Charge means you might be able to catch some things that otherwise you couldn't, and potentially you can even spend a command point to fire the heavy weapons when advancing. That does seem like you could basically have your cake and eat it there. Iron Hands I think are generally going to be worth mentioning whenever you have vehicles. They've got their vehicle synergy and reroll ones for the heavy weapons, plus a little bit of extra toughness and some support options in the codex. The Salamanders seem like a good fit as well. Melt of Fire generally goes down pretty well with them, and I still quite like the single wound reroll that they get as well, though I guess it might push you a bit more towards the fists rather than the talons. I think there's a pretty reasonable chance that you wouldn't be failing more than one wound roll per turn anyway. Could mean it's a bit less of a trade-off to take all of those bolt shots. Talking of bolt shots, the Imperial Fist might like the Heavy Bolter plus Auto Bolt Rifle loadout. That's a lot of exploding sixes there, plus adding a bit of melee to the army. For the Templars, there's plenty of good options for supporting Dreadnoughts, in particular being pretty much flat tougher with the 5+ Invul Vow will be quite nice, plus there's some good melee support options. The Space Wolves and the Blood Angels all both like the melee things that those chapters can do for them, particularly their unique assault doctrines. I'd say that Deathwatch do okay with Dreadnought Castles. You could have that Dominus Aegis relic on the go, maybe this and a couple of Redemptors supported by characters, maybe this one towards the front ranks to get the closer range guns in range, plus have that melee profile for a countercharge early. Just a few ideas, of course. I feel like some chapters like White Scars, Iron Hands, Salamanders and Templars might just have a bit more fun with this than some of the others though. Anyway, been fun to take a bit more of a close look at the Brutalis Dreadnought and those leaked rules. If they do turn out to be accurate, then I'd say that he seems solidly usable in game, though perhaps not top tier auto include from these profiles. I definitely feel like it has advantages over the Redemptor, which is quite a good model in itself, but I feel like the two models would certainly have their role, depending on exactly what you're trying to use them for. Certainly looks like it packs a massive punch in combat though, if you do let it charge an expensive vehicle and you've got those claws. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the model. Do you think that this guy's going to be strong, and would you be tempted to pick one up? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I will certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and I'll hope to do a counterpart video to this one on the new Desolation Squad as well, talking about a few potential combos with their rules. Feel free to subscribe or check back later if you'd like to see that. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's how I can afford to keep on making such regular videos like this just about every day. I do try and give channel Patreons a few rewards, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.